Welcome to our Voices of Africa podcast, brought to you by Africa Practice, a strategic advisory firm supplying insights and advocacy solutions to corporations, investors, governments, and foundations in Africa. In a world with complex and interdependent challenges, we take the guesswork out of business engagement. We enable our clients to see more clearly in order to drive sustainable and equitable development.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Voices of Africa. This is the last episode in our series with investing in African mining Indaba and the African Minerals Development Centre. We've had a series speaking with leading voices in Africa's mining sector and those working in the minerals value chain to manufacture and process products and materials from Africa's mineral resources. Today, we're going to be speaking with Ellie Gomez-Callus. She's a metals and mining associate at BloombergNEF. For those of you who don't know, BloombergNEF is a research organization that supports energy professionals and policymakers. Ellie's research covers global critical minerals policies and battery metal markets, and she has been focused on pathways to decarbonization for the mining sector. We're going to be diving into key insights from BloombergNEF's flagship report, the 2024 New Energy Outlook, which presents two potential scenarios for the energy transition. We're fortunate to have Ellie because she's intensely well qualified to discuss with us the opportunities and challenges ahead for Africa in navigating this clean energy transition. So Ellie, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me today, Marcus. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're speaking on the eve of the 2025 Investing in African Mining Indaba. That's why my co-host, Laura Nicholson, is not able to join us today. She's flat out making final preparations for that conference in Cape Town, where we will be attending, of course. We usually start by inviting you to tell us about yourself, Ellie. What brought you to BloombergNEF? The career choices that you've made and the role that you're playing now as a metals and mining analyst at BloombergNEF.
Great. So my story here is a bit of a zigzagging one, but I feel like when you speak to most people in the industry, that's the sort of norm. Because when it comes to my job history, so I'm actually a chemist by trade and studied chemistry during my undergraduate degree and during my master's. During that, we had a lot of projects which looked at energy and the future of energy. And I thought, you know what, I want to work in that because at the end of the day, we're always going to need energy, and it's going through this massive transition period. My first role was actually in the lab, sticking with my chemistry background. I worked in sort of energy storage and hydrogen startup, which was super interesting. And it was great to see progress on an individual level. But working in the lab wasn't really for me. I wanted to get out there and have more interaction with industry makers and policy makers. And that's where I ended up next. So I ended up in the UK government. I worked for what was the Department of Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy. And here I looked at oil and gas policy and the decarbonisation of oil and gas. This was quite a controversial role. We were constantly getting correspondence from the public saying, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? But it was really interesting because it essentially gave me insight into how policy is made and how our existing energy infrastructure will continue to be the foundation on the road to net zero. So after about 18 months of doing that, I thought I want to dig a bit deeper into the net zero side of things. And I came across a role at BloombergNEF in metals and mining. And I spoke with the person who's now my manager, and it just worked. It just sort of felt like, you know what, this is where I'm meant to be. And I'm almost 3 years down the line now. And it's been great to sort of look at the energy transition from more of a supply chain perspective, and particularly the upstream, because I feel like we don't get enough attention in the mining world sometimes, particularly when it comes to the energy transition.
Oh, well, thanks for that overview. Our audience can't see you, but I can. You're sat in Bloomberg's head office in London. in a very smart office with cameras everywhere and a Bloomberg terminal in front of you. You look very comfortable, happy. Well, yes, I'm sitting in a hotel in Joburg. I'm on my way home this evening. But for our audience, if the audio quality is not as good as it usually is, it's because I forgot to pack my amp and big microphone. So apologies. But let's crack on. You mentioned the work you've been doing in researching policy, and I want to come on to that a little bit later because I want to specifically ask you about lessons that African governments can draw in seeking to design and deliver policies that can attract capital investment into the energy transition. But we'll come on to that a bit later. I referenced in the preamble the flagship BloombergNEF report, the New Energy Outlook. Can you give us a quick summary of that report and what it states?
Sure. So we do this exercise every year. It's a big exercise. The team that are involved spend the whole year essentially updating our models. And what it does is it produces two key scenarios. We have our economic transition scenario. This is where we look at the current emissions from oil, gas, and coal, and the trajectory that these emissions are going to go on based on economically driven technology changes. So, for example, the model will consider using solar if it is cheaper than another energy source. And it sort of works out what our world could look like if it continues following these economic transition changes. But then, of course, lots of scenarios, of course, there's lots of targets solving net zero. So alongside this base case, we also produce a net zero scenario. This is essentially a scenario that is quite tough, but also achievable. And it essentially says that by 2050, global emissions will meet that net zero threshold. And the way it does that is it looks at the deployment of different technologies across different regions of the world and sees where these different technologies offer emissions saving. And essentially, this report forms the foundation of the work that we do at BloombergNEF. We have sector teams like metals, solar, renewables, hydrogen, and all our sort of forecasts and scenarios are based off what is put forward in this new energy outlook.
Thank you for that, Ellie. I want to come on to adoption of new energy technologies in a moment. Before we do that, though, I want to focus on minerals. We know that the energy transition requires a massive ramp up in production of minerals, all these critical minerals that are needed for the transition. Can you help us to understand what quantum of additional production is going to be required and where you see that production coming from, which regions of the world? Particularly, I'd like you to focus on African countries, if you will.
As I mentioned, New Energy Outlook is a base of the work we do. And from that, the metals team produces the Transition Metals Outlook. And this looks at the role of energy transition metals, of which we look at around 12 across the sectors. And under our base case scenario, we expect demand for these energy transition metals to almost be double what it was compared to 2020. And this is considering all metals together as one. We look at copper, nickel, lithium, also to rare earths, platinum group metals, and we look at the whole spectrum. And because of the supply chains of these different metals coming on in different regions, when it comes to lithium, we see that a lot of new supply is expected to come online in South America, Chile, Argentina, but also Australia. However, one of the fastest growing regions within the lithium space is Africa. We've seen a lot of investment in the space at the moment, and due to some of the low cost production that can happen within the region, from now to 2030, supply in Africa is set to ramp up in the lithium space. So that's one example. But I think it's also important to look at sort of the global dynamics, because something that's important to a lot of nations at the moment is security of supply. We are seeing supply expanding in these expected regions, but we're also seeing governments and consuming nations moving towards supply chain resilience and supply chain security. And this means that they're looking to onshore some of the parts of the value chain when it comes to critical minerals. So I think moving forward, we're going to see more of the same, but we're also going to see a lot of dynamics which are changing and will shift over time.
The sense that I'm getting with your statement is that there's this trend towards onshoring, particularly from the US and the EU. Does that mean that Africa is going to miss out on exploitation of what we know to be abundant minerals, including energy transition minerals, and unexplored deposits that may exist, because the continent remains one of the most unexplored in the world? Is there a general fear that Africa won't realize the economic gain from the energy transition? I think I read somewhere that your research shows the market for minerals from the energy transition is something of the magnitude of $10 trillion that you've estimated. Are you as concerned as I'm inferring about Africa missing out on this opportunity?
So when it comes to Africa, they're in a really unique position where, as you mentioned, of course, there's abundance of critical minerals and critical minerals reserves that are here to be utilised. However, if you look at the current industry, it's focused predominantly on the extraction side of things, and the value-add activity doesn't necessarily happen within the region. So I think when it comes to grasping this opportunity, it's coming down to, okay, how can we gain these value-add activities in the country, and what do we need to help us get there? There are countries in the world, for example, China, and in some instances the US, that have got this sort of refining stages down to a T. So I don't think we have to look at it as one country via another. I think that the key is looking at it in terms of collaboration. Who and how can Africa effectively partner with other countries and regions that can help them get their industry off the ground while still being able to benefit it on home soil, and finding the balance between that partnership and sort of like local industry will be really important to make sure that Africa doesn't miss out on this opportunity.
Thank you. Yes, we've covered in previous episodes the importance being attached to African countries participating higher up the value chain beyond extraction. We had the African Union, African Minerals Development Centre, and more recently we had a couple of entrepreneurs in the auto manufacturing industry and battery storage industry talking about their initiatives to strengthen mineral value chains and add value domestically. I want to talk about policy because your work involves researching policy of various governments all over the world when it comes to critical minerals. You referred to the US and China, who are very advanced in having developed refining capacity. I've heard you speak before, and you've referred to the importance that governments should attach to expansion, acceleration, diversification, and sustainability in mineral value chains. I wonder if you could elaborate on that and from your perspective of studying countries, articulate for us what, in your view, constitutes good policy from nations that are richly endowed in critical minerals, and whether we can draw some lessons that could be applied. Particularly, I'm thinking around incentives and directives, sort of carrots and sticks that can help accelerate the participation of African mineral producers further up the value chains.
So one thing that I can say for sure is that at the moment, there is no such thing as a perfect critical minerals policy, because perfect suggests that everyone will be happy, and unfortunately this can't always be guaranteed. And I think when it comes to driving and building industry, it can be particularly difficult for governments who have to juggle these conflicting priorities. So yes, we need more critical minerals, but it's also happening at a time where climate disasters are worsening, where economies are faltering, and where there's several conflicts. So I think it's important to put things into context and give some compassion to governments when looking at the policy they're forming and how it can be effective. When it comes to the critical mineral sectors, policy frameworks that promote stability and transparency seem to be the most effective. Policy can be made up of various measures. Different nations use a range of these measures. For example, it could be fiscal incentives, it could be targets and regulations, it could be trade restrictions. They use these mechanisms to form a complementary suite of measures that enhance the unique characteristics of a country. So I think it's important that when policy is made, it isn't just copying what has been successful elsewhere. Governments need to look at what is needed in a certain region and how can they put together the right tools to help develop that. This said, there's two main non-negotiables. I think policy, firstly, should help companies achieve cost competitiveness against global supply chains. Across critical mineral supply chains at the moment, we're in a massive oversupply. So helping to address that is super important. And then second, policy just needs to be simple. It needs to be simple, wide-reaching, and available in the long term to ensure that the government's commitment to industry is cemented. We spoke briefly on the US, and I think the US Inflation Reduction Act provides a good example of this. When we look at the production tax credits for critical mineral producers, there's essentially no expiry date and no budget limit. It seems that getting access to these credits once they decide if they're eligible is relatively simple for industry. Now, I'm not saying that African countries need to replicate this, but it can act as a positive case study for policymakers, what can be achieved when clear intent is demonstrated. After some of the sweets that were introduced within the Inflation Reduction Act, around $4 billion in investments in metals and mining came to the US. And this happened during a time where the industry was struggling. So it's about finding the set of mechanisms that works for a country, but also making the policy clear, simple, and long-term.
Thank you, Ellie. That's really clear. I mentioned that I wanted to talk about the state of technology development on the continent, particularly the state of battery storage, carbon capture and storage, and even clean hydrogen. You reference the incentives as part of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US that have encouraged hydrogen producers to direct their energies and capital to hydrogen production in America, as opposed to what might have been potentially more attractive markets in the developing world where solar radiation quality or availability of water might have been better, but where the subsidies and tax credits introduced under the IRA have invited them to divert their attentions to the US. Can you tell us good examples of where African countries have been assigning priority to these new technologies and where they're achieving a degree of success?
Sure. I can try and give a bit of context about this. When it comes to these emerging technologies, and if we start with battery storage, it all is tied back to industries such as the solar industry. So my first time in Africa was actually only in 2023, which is slightly embarrassing. But I went to Zimbabwe, and whether I was driving through the chaos of Harare or the chillness of the mountains in Yanga, I always saw solar panels. Like, solar panels were literally everywhere because it was the most reliable and cost-effective way to ensure electricity to homes and businesses. I think that's when I really realized that in a lot of African nations and emerging markets, opportunity is there and it is being harnessed. What some of our forecasts from the solar team at BNEF see demand for solar skyrocketing over the next few years, and that particularly happens in 3 African regions, which is Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt. When you think about the growth of solar in these places, it sort of leads to, okay, this is a first step, but then what's next? And that's where stuff like energy storage comes in. So where countries are taking advantage of their solar potential, we also expect batteries to be right alongside them. When it comes to stuff like hydrogen, I don't know as much. However, what I would say is that when it comes to African countries trying to prioritize and address these technologies, it's about finding their niche and finding their competitive advantage. It's unrealistic to say that every country can do everything. When it comes to deploying these new technologies, governments need to take a step back and coordinate. So we have a framework here at BNEF when it comes to building supply chains, which is coordinate, incentivize, and build. This first step, coordinate, is really important in working out where these technologies can play a role. It's not about picking winners or losers. It's about having a thorough assessment to see whether these technologies can actually be deployed effectively. There's something that is quite interesting, which I'd recommend looking at, is that within BNEF, we have an annual report called Climate Scope. It looks at the different policies and technologies from a transport, power, and buildings perspective, and clean hydrogen has been added into this recently. And you can look at the different policies and whether a country has policies in place. I definitely recommend people take a look at this Climate Scope website to investigate deeper the potential action and development of these new technologies within the climate space.
Great. Well, thank you, Ellie. Gave us a perspective on different energy technologies being applied and the imperative for nations to play to their comparative strengths. You spoke to solar specifically and touched a little bit on hydrogen. It's exciting to see the scale of solar deployment on a continent. And I'm optimistic that hydrogen in particular countries will see progress and the fruits of their efforts in the near term. But the last question that I want to invite you to address for us is one that we ask all of our guests, and that is to paint a picture for us of a prosperous Africa that inspires the world. You spend your professional time looking at the potential and the opportunities for green mineral processing on the continent, refining, clean energy. I wonder if you're in a position to paint for us from your perspective the potential that you see for Africa to accelerate its participation in both mineral processing, manufacturing, and the clean energy transition.
Of course. So I feel like, without a doubt, Africa's potential is there. However, what Africa needs to address is some underlying actions that can help them harness their potential across this. And this is focused partially around policy, but really around building a solid foundation in which various green industries can build. So if we look at a prosperous Africa, it would have successful economic linkages. So the region would be able to promote these linkages, whether they be fiscal, spatial, forward, backward, to help accelerate the progression in the energy transition. And this would be like the first step in the right direction. And this and part of this lot of linkages would be looking at what we spoke about earlier, understanding the local and national characteristics that can act as an anchor for a wider growth in certain countries and within the region. But alongside this, I think another part of these linkages, which definitely require a lot more attention, is infrastructure and skills. So a prosperous Africa would also ideally probably have something like cross-industry collaboration in which they could take advantage of the mutual benefit of investing in these supporting sectors. And like with many things in life, whether it be trying to bake a cake, trying to build a critical minerals sector, trying to build a flat pack, when you combine your ambitions and your resources, it really does accelerate progress. And then we come to building an attractive business landscape. Now, this is super important because if investors don't want to come to the region, then Africa won't be able to prosper as much as it can and much as it deserves to. So ensuring that there are a range of tools in place that can help de-risk these investments and help align best practices, both in the finance space, but also in terms of some of the government-led initiatives that will exist. And finally, a prosperous Africa will also really focus on community engagement. So stakeholders are at the heart of development, and ensuring that interactions with communities are streamlined can really help drive progress forwards. And this includes things like increased transparency, but I think it comes down to the simple things. It's collaborating and collaborating early. So if African countries can focus on these four things, I really think that the future is bright.
Well, that's a nice phrase on which to end on. Thank you for your time, Ellie, today, and really grateful that you managed to speak with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning into a Voices of Africa podcast this week. Voices of Africa is a forum where Africa's leading experts weigh in on cross-sectional topics affecting the continent. Experts share their views on how we can unlock greater value that will benefit industry, government, and communities. For more of our insights, visit our website or subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Views on Africa, in the description.